You are a young Greek slave, torn from your homeland, auctioned like livestock. And tonight, you're the centerpiece of a Roman banquet. Candles flicker across, gold-plated platters and blood-red goblets. The emperor laughs. A senator snaps his fingers. You're handed a perfumed oil and told to undress. This isn't just pleasure. It's power. Centuries ago, Julius Caesar was mocked as the queen of Bithynia, not for loving a king, but for submitting to one. Augustus preached family virtue, even as his own daughter was exiled for adultery. Claudius married Messalina, who was rumored to run a brothel from the palace itself. And Hadrian? He wept for a boy he turned into a god in shadowed chambers. Doctors like Galen claimed women were just broken men. And Cyrannus of Ephesus wrote quiet instructions for abortions in a world where the womb was state property. Because, in Rome, sex wasn't private. It was performance, ritual, control. And you? You are the offering. So how far did Roman depravity really go? And who was forced to play the role? The night begins with music, soft, seductive flutes drifting through marble halls. The smell of roasted lamb and rosewater oils fills the air. Torches crackle as laughter erupts from reclining men in silk-trimmed togas. This isn't just a ball. Feast. It's a theater. And the main act? You. Whether you're a slave, a courtesan, or even a nobleman's wife. Tonight, your body is not yours. Because in Rome, the line between public and private didn't exist. Sex wasn't something hidden in bedrooms. It was flaunted in dining rooms, bathhouses, even temples. Intimacy belonged to the gods, the state, and the powerful men who controlled both. In the homes of the elite, sex was a performance, carefully timed, strategically positioned. Banquets were often capped with sexual entertainments. A virgin slave made to dance, 2 boys ordered to wrestle naked, or a concubine paraded before guests like a prized vintage. For the host, it was a display of dominance. For the guests, a reminder of their place in the Roman hierarchy. The home of a senator might look like a palace, but it functioned like a stage. Every archway framed the action. Every servant knew their cue. Curtains didn't close, they parted. Even the architecture whispered what Rome believed. That power is visibility, and shame is weakness. The more someone is watched, the less they belong to themselves. In the palace of Emperor Claudius, it was whispered that his wife Messalina held secret contests with prostitutes, not in private chambers, but under the same roofs where senators dined and slaves watched. Even the empress was expected to perform. It wasn't only slaves who were objectified. Elite women, too, were caught in the trap. A wife was expected to appear pure, but also alluring. Silent, but beautiful. Her virtue was judged not by what she did in secret, but by what she appeared to be in public. And if her husband wanted her to perform for others, she obeyed. In this world, sex wasn't a choice. It was a tool, a transaction, a test. Because in Rome, the bedroom had no doors, only eyes. In Roman bathhouses, open-air pools, and steamy chambers where senators bathed alongside slaves, gossip and desire soaked into every stone. The bath was a sanctuary of surveillance. Bodies were judged, touched, offered. No one truly bathed alone. Here men boasted of their lovers, their boys, their boys. A man's sexual power was not measured by affection or loyalty, but by conquest. The more visible, the better. A mistress displayed at the games, a slave fondled during lunch, a wife shared with a business partner. These weren't scandals. They were power moves. Julius Caesar, Rome's most feared general, was once ridiculed not for losing battles, but for the boyhood rumor that he had submitted to a foreign king. In Rome, sex was not about love. It was about posture. To dominate was Roman. To be dominated was not. Even religion played its part. Temples dedicated to Venus or Priapus included public rituals involving fertility, phallic imagery, and, in some cults, ceremonial sex. To worship meant to display. To participate meant to surrender shame. And to observe meant power. Visibility was everything. When a woman committed adultery, the law, under Emperor Augustus, demanded her punishment be public. She could be paraded half-naked through the forum. Her name listed for all to read. Her father's status, her husband's honor, even the emperor's image, all affected by her body's perceived violation. But the reverse wasn't true. When a man took a slave, whether female or male, the law turned its face. It was not considered adultery because a slave had no legal self, no boundaries to violate. Their body was simply an extension of their master's will. And so the empire built its sexual rituals not on mutual desire, but on asymmetry. One body watched, one body displayed, one man entertained, one woman endured. And in every case, someone else was watching. In the private villas of Pompeii and Herculaneum, frescoes still cover the walls, not with battle scenes or poetry, but with sex, graphic, explicit, proud. Gods and mortals tangled in twisted positions, women mounted, boys kneeling, satyrs grinning. These weren't hidden. They were placed in the triclinium, the dining room, for all to see. In Rome, sexual imagery was not shameful. It was status. The more erotic your art, the more cultured you appeared. It showed you were above superstition, above morality, above modesty. But that was a lie, because underneath the marble, under the laughter and the gold and the incense, was terror. For the slave who dropped the wine, for the girl whose beauty caught the wrong eye, for the boy ordered to follow a drunken guest into the garden. There was no no. There was only silence. And that silence was demanded not just by masters, but by survival itself. Even elite women who smiled behind painted eyes learned how to fold themselves into invisibility. A perfect wife made no scenes. A perfect concubine made no demands. A perfect slave made no sound unless told. Emperor Hadrian, after losing his young lover Antinous to the Nile, sculpted his grief across the empire. Dozens of statues, temples, rituals. His mourning became empire-wide spectacle. Even love, when imperial, had to be watched. Doctors like Galen called women inverted men, explaining away pleasure and pain with cold diagrams, turning the body into a map of submission and the soul into a shadow. And still, some women found whispers of resistance. Hidden among scrolls, Cyrannus of Ephesus wrote quiet instructions for birth control, not for freedom, but for survival. His ink was a woman's only shield. Sex in Rome was everywhere. But the people trapped in it, they were not seen. Not truly. Because Rome didn't want sex. It wanted proof of its own power. And every time a body was made visible without consent, Rome reminded the world who ruled it. If you're new here, and stories like this speak to the dark side of history they never taught us, the hidden rituals, the forbidden truths the people history tried to erase, then I invite you to subscribe. This channel uncovers one disturbing story at a time. And I want to hear from you. What hidden corner of history should I explore next? Tell me in the comments, and your idea might just become the next episode. Now, let's move to the next chapter. The slave market is loud, not with voices, but with the dull noise of appraisal, the squinting of buyers, the clink of coins, the bark of an overseer demanding a child open their mouth. You're 10, naked, bruised, standing on a wooden platform as men argue over your price. Not for your skills, but for your body. You feel their eyes on your ribs, your thighs, your silence. They don't want a servant. They want a vessel. This is not a shadowy alley or a criminal underworld. This is the heart of Roman commerce. Open, legal, and essential. The Roman Empire ran on human flesh. At its height, there were as many as one slave for every free person. Some came from war, prisoners dragged across continents. Others, like you, were born into it. Or worse, sold by parents to pay off taxes, grain, or gambling debts. And in Rome, your fate wasn't just labor. It was used. Sexual use wasn't an added cruelty. It was part of the purchase. In many cases, why you were bought in the first place. A girl's virginity to double her value. A boy with delicate features fetched more if he was silent. A woman with Greek blood, exotic. Educated, was a prized concubine. Buyers examined genitals, touched hips, checked teeth for age. Slaves were sometimes marked with chalk. Good for breeding, docile, trained. And if the master changed his mind, the slave could be rented, leased, or sold again. Sexual slavery in Rome wasn't hidden. It was normalized, even glorified. Wealthy men didn't just own slaves. They displayed them like art. At dinner parties, a young pure delicatus might pour wine shirtless, his eyes downcast. He wasn't just decoration. He was available. If a guest wanted him, the master might offer, as a gesture of hospitality or humiliation. This wasn't shameful. It was power. Julius Caesar, before becoming dictator, was said to have kept both male and female lovers from Gaul. After his conquest, it was expected. To conquer land was to conquer its bodies. Claudius, awkward, stammering, underestimated, found dominance not in speeches, but in the bedrooms of his palace. His wife Messalina didn't shock the empire because she slept with many, but because she blurred the line between empress and prostitute. That line in Rome was razor-thin. Augustus, determined to restore public virtue, passed moral legislation targeting adultery and female promiscuity. But his own daughter Julia was exiled, not for sex, but for getting caught. The market didn't just enslave the poor. It warped the expectations of the elite. Men were trained to consume. Women were trained to endure. Slaves, they were trained to disappear, even when touched. The philosopher-physician Galen dissected animals and corpses to understand anatomy, but he wrote about women's sexual organs as inferior, hidden, internal. He helped justify the idea that some bodies were made to serve and some to rule. Even Serenus of Ephesus, who showed remarkable empathy for women's health, could not escape the economy around him. His medical manuals detailed how to maintain a concubine's body, how to preserve beauty, prevent pregnancy, and keep a slave useful longer. This wasn't science. It was strategy. In the Roman brothel, nothing was private, not even pain. Names were scratched into the stone. Daphne, Felix, Marcus, Livia. Each room had a crude fresco on the wall, not art, but a menu. A pose, a price. Clients pointed. Slaves obeyed. Some were chained by the ankle. Others were leased from private owners, earning money for their master's household while their bodies decayed from used. And still, buyers came. Politicians, merchants, even philosophers. Because in Rome, pleasure wasn't the opposite of violence. It was violence, wrapped in perfume and coins. When Hadrian mourned his young companion Antinous, some whispered it was love. Others said the boy had no choice. He had been given, offered, trained. And when Antinous drowned, Hadrian responded. Not with silence, but with statues, temples, cities. His grief became public spectacle. Even death couldn't give the boy his own name, because in Rome, not even memory was private. A slave's body belonged to the buyer. Their labor, their pleasure, their silence. They were forbidden to marry, denied parenthood, and punished if they resisted. But their body could be used for reproduction, as long as the child became property, too. The slave market made sex transactional. But more than that, It made it industrial. And so, for every grand villa with mosaic floors and golden goblets, there were hundreds of bodies beneath, feeding it, cleaning it, pleasing it, their value measured not in dignity, but in silence, their price paid not once, but every night, again and again. When Augustus took power, Rome was still bleeding from civil war. Decades of bloodshed, betrayal, and backroom stabbings. To rule an empire this fractured, he needed more than armies. He needed order, and not just in the streets, in the bedroom. So he rewrote the rules of morality. In 18 BC, Augustus introduced a sweeping set of laws known as the Lex Julia, aimed at restoring virtue, pudicitia, sexual modesty, and the ideal Roman family. At least, that's what he claimed. Adultery, once a private shame, became a public offense. It was no longer a sin, but a crime. A father could legally execute his daughter and her lover if caught in the act. A husband was required to divorce a cheating wife or risk punishment himself. Even whispers of scandal could mean exile. The laws were brutal and surgical. Augustus targeted women most of all. They were seen as the root of moral decay. Too much perfume, too many poets, too much Greek softness in their speech and clothing. A proper Roman woman was chaste, silent, loyal, the mirror of Rome's imagined past. The Lex Julia wasn't just about punishing lust. It rewarded reproduction. Women who bore 3 or more children gained legal privileges, the jus trium liberorum, giving them some freedom from male guardianship. But sex outside the state-sanctioned model? That was degeneracy. Behind closed doors, people whispered. Could a man who seduced Cleopatra and fathered children with multiple lovers really enforce purity? But Augustus didn't care about whispers. He wanted control. He wanted Rome to see him not just as an emperor, but as a father of the nation. And fathers punish. The irony hit home, literally. Augustus's only daughter, Julia, grew up surrounded by propaganda about honor and discipline. But she also grew up watching her father manipulate marriages like chess pieces, including her own. Julia was married, off at 14, to her cousin Marcellus. When he died, she was given to Agrippa, her father's general. She bore 5 children. When Agrippa died, Augustus forced her to marry Tiberius, a man she hated. Julia was witty, charming, politically sharp, and suffocating in a palace that demanded silence. So, like many elite women before her, she turned to lovers. Not in secret. Not in rebellion. In survival. She was accused of hosting late-night parties on the Capitol Hill, of sleeping with senators, poets, gladiators. Some said she drank openly in the Forum. Others claimed she met lovers under the very statues of her father's laws. The Senate gasped. Augustus seethed, but the Lex Julia left no space for mercy, even for his daughter. He banished Julia to a barren island, Pandateria, without husband, children, or visitors. Her mother, Scribonia, volunteered to go with her, perhaps knowing the isolation would destroy her. Later, Julia's daughter, also named Julia, would be exiled for adultery. 2. Augustus's granddaughter. Same crime. Same sentence. He had created a world so rigid that even his own blood broke under it. The people mourned. The Senate stayed silent, and Augustus? He doubled down. His laws remained untouched, because the performance mattered more than the pain. He wasn't just the maker of rules. He was now their enforcer, even at the cost of family. Outwardly, Augustus painted the empire in symbols of modesty. Temples to Mars the Avenger and Apollo the Pure. Statues of modest women draped in veils. A calendar lined with religious festivals promoting marriage, motherhood, and masculine virtue. But the city behind it all? Still rotting with desire. Prostitutes lined the Subura. Erotic poems flowed from exiled writers like Ovid, whose ars amatoria dared to mock the Lex Julia, advising lovers on how to seduce married women. For this, Augustus sent him far from Rome, a cultural exile for a cultural crime. Even within the palace, nothing was clean. Tiberius, Julia's third husband, would go on to become emperor, and his own reign would spiral into darkness, obsession, and retreat. Later emperors like Caligula and Nero would abandon any pretense of morality, indulging in public incest, forced marriages, and staged sexual performances. Augustus had tried to build a moral fortress, but he'd merely drawn a curtain and Rome tore it down, because the Lex Julia didn't end depravity. It institutionalized hypocrisy that had punished women for pleasure, but ignored male predation. It preached modesty while tolerating elite abuse. It upheld the family while destroying it from within. Still, many Roman citizens believed in the illusion. They recited the laws. They parroted the slogans. They married and watched their daughters be sent to strangers at 12. They bought Greek slaves and called it inheritance, because when the emperor sets the tone, no one dares to sing off key. In the Roman imagination, a woman could only be one of two things: a Vestal virgin, silent, cloaked in white, untouchable, or a Messalina, shameless, seductive, corrupted by pleasure. There was no in-between. From childhood, elite Roman girls were trained not in freedom, but in form. They were taught how to walk without sound, how to lower their gaze, how to endure the silence of arranged marriages to aging men twice their age. Their worth was measured by obedience and their wombs. Yet, behind closed doors, power whispered different rules. Roman emperors arranged marriages for politics, not affection. And the women trapped inside these gilded cages often turned to survival through influence, seduction, or secrecy. No story captures this better than that of Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. She wasn't born a nobody. She came from a noble line, a descendant of Augustus himself. But by the time she was empress, she would be remembered not for her lineage, but for what Roman historians claimed she did between the sheets. Was it all true? Or just the cost of power in a system that couldn't tolerate an ambitious woman? In Rome, love was not a question of gender, but of power. A Roman man could desire women. He could desire boys. He could keep lovers, slaves, and concubines. His freedoms were nearly limitless, but only as long as he remained the dominant partner. To be penetrated, willingly, especially as an adult male, was shameful. It wasn't the act of sex that disturbed Roman sensibilities. It was who had the power. Sex was an extension of empire. Just as Rome conquered foreign lands, a Roman man was expected to conquer bodies, not surrender his own. The lines weren't drawn between gay and straight. They were drawn between conqueror and conquered. Even Roman law didn't criminalize same-sex acts. It only punished freeborn male citizens who took on a passive role. That role, in the Roman mind, belonged to slaves, prostitutes, or foreigners, never to a citizen of rank. And yet, one of Rome's greatest names, Julius Caesar, would spend his life haunted by accusations that violated this very code. Claudius was not a warrior emperor. He limped, he stammered, and many saw him as weak. But he held the imperial seal, and that made him dangerous. Messalina, still in her teens when they married, was beautiful, calculating, and intensely aware of the spotlight. The court feared her influence. Senators whispered. Slaves watched her rise. Soon the rumors began. They said she took lovers in secret, that she seduced actors, gladiators, nobles, that she arranged executions for wives who caught her with their husbands. But the most infamous story, repeated by Tacitus, Juvenal, and Suetonius, was almost too perverse to believe. According to Roman gossip, Messalina competed with a prostitute in a night-long contest of endurance, not in wit or beauty, but in sex. The prostitute allegedly gave up after 25 men. Messalina, the Empress of Rome, went further. Why would Rome believe or invent such a tale? Because to the Roman mind, a woman with sexual agency was dangerous, uncontainable, and once she stepped beyond the bounds of modesty, she became monstrous. Historians say she married her lover Gaius Silius in secret while Claudius was away. A potential coup disguised as a wedding. Whether it was ambition or a fantasy gone too far, the result was the same: betrayal. Claudius was devastated, manipulated, cuckolded, publicly humiliated. But Rome doesn't forgive emperors who look weak. Messalina was dragged to the gardens of Lucullus, the same place she had once played as a bride, and executed, alone, without trial. Her mother, they say, begged her to die with dignity. She couldn't die in the final moments. A soldier had to drive the sword through her neck himself. Julius Caesar, general, consul, orator, dictator. To his supporters, he was a military genius and a political reformer. To his enemies, he was a tyrant in waiting, and something even worse, a man who had let himself be used. The rumors began when Caesar was still a teenager, sent to Bithynia on diplomatic duty. There, he stayed at the court of King Nicomedes IV, a Hellenistic ruler known for his wealth, charm, and affection for handsome young men. Caesar stayed longer than expected. When he returned to Rome, whispers followed. His soldiers, his political rivals, even Cicero himself took aim. They said Caesar hadn't just been a guest, he had been a boy toy, that he had submitted to the king of Bithynia. He was mocked on the Senate floor as the Queen of Bithynia. Graffiti scrawled on tavern walls said, "Caesar offered his backside to Nicomedes." He was a brilliant general, yes, but how could Rome trust a man who had let himself be ruled in bed? Caesar fought back hard. He denied the rumors, ridiculed his accusers, and even published detailed records of his sexual conquests of women to reassert his masculinity. But the stain remained, even decades later, during his triumphal parade. After conquering Gaul, his own troops chanted songs mocking his submissive past. Caesar conquered Gaul, but Nicomedes conquered Caesar. In a society that worshipped dominance, submission was the deepest cut. After Messalina's death, the empire did not repent. It rewrote. Poets turned her into a cautionary tale. Busts of her were smashed, her name erased from records. And Claudius, the grieving husband, remarried quickly to Agrippina, who would later poison him to place her son Nero on the throne. But Rome never stopped craving Messalina. She was invoked again and again. Whenever a woman in power rose too high, she was the whore queen, the anti-Vestal. A fantasy and a threat. It didn't matter that Claudius himself frequented prostitutes, or that other emperors paraded their sexual exploits openly. When a woman transgressed, she was unclean, dangerous, disposable. This dichotomy, goddess or whore, seeped into every layer of Roman society. A woman could be a mother, yes, but never too visible. She could be a widow, but not too wealthy. She could serve the gods, but never lead the state. Those who obeyed were worshipped. Those who questioned were erased. Even Galen, the famed physician of the time, warned of women's weaker natures. He categorized their bodies as inherently unstable, prone to hysteria, needing regulation through marriage and motherhood. Soranus of Ephesus, another renowned Greek physician practicing in Rome, wrote manuals on gynecology. He dissected women's pain, cataloged childbirth techniques, but always framed the female body as something to be controlled. Rome didn't just conquer lands. It colonized the female body. And Messalina, whether sinner or scapegoat, was its most haunting mirror. The Roman world had no room for vulnerability in men. A Roman man could kiss his slave. He could sleep with boys or concubines of any gender. But he could never cry, never yield, never love too deeply, unless that love reinforced his superiority. This wasn't intimacy. It was performance. In brothels and bathhouses, painted frescoes showed men in all positions, but those on the bottom were always slaves or foreigners. In elite homes, sexual murals showed dominance like a trophy case. Even Galen, the empire's leading physician, believed that male sperm was a symbol of life and strength. To release it was noble, to receive it was degrading. Cyrannus of Ephesus, in his gynecological treatises, discussed male same-sex desire only in terms of imbalance or psychological deviation, unless it aligned with proper social roles. The hypocrisy was staggering. The Emperor Hadrian, centuries later, would mourn the death of his Greek lover Antinous, building temples in his name. Yet even he insisted on shaping Antinous into an eternal youth, beautiful, yes, but never equal. Rome could tolerate desire. It could not tolerate weakness. And that's what made Julius Caesar's alleged passivity so dangerous to his image. In the Roman mind, a man who once yielded might yield again, in war, in politics, in Rome itself. So even as Caesar rose, he kept one eye on those rumors, always proving, always performing. His conquest of Gaul, his brutal suppression of rebellions, all served as armor against the whispers of Bithynia. When he crossed the Rubicon and seized power, it wasn't just about dictatorship. It was about reasserting his dominance over a city that had mocked him. And when he was stabbed in the Senate, some said it was not just political. It was retribution for a man who had dared to blur the lines. Antinous was Greek, born in Bithynia, the same region where Julius Caesar had faced whispers of submission. But Antinous had no citizenship, no rank, no power. His beauty made him visible, but his body was not his own. Hadrian first saw him during a provincial visit. The boy, likely a teenager, was brought into his circle, trained in the court's rituals, and placed by the emperor's side, not as an equal. As a possession, Roman law never forbade male-male relationships, but it enforced roles. The Roman dominates, the foreigner submits. Antinous, young and Greek, fit this role perfectly. Desirable, silent, shaped to please. They traveled together. From Athens to Alexandria, to the temples of Isis and Osiris. Hadrian adored him not just for lust, but for what he represented. Greece, youth, purity, things that the aging emperor could no longer claim for himself. Then came the Nile. Antinous, drowned during a sacred festival, the Osiris Mysteries. Some claimed it was accidental. Others whispered darker things, that the boy had offered himself willingly as part of a mystical sacrifice to preserve Hadrian's life. In Roman mystery religions, blood sealed the pact. Youth and beauty were seen as worthy vessels. And Hadrian, grief-stricken or guilt-ridden, made sure the world would remember not the boy, but the myth. Within weeks of his death, Antinous became immortal. Hadrian named a city after him, Antinopolis, built on the very site of his drowning. Sculptors chiseled his likeness across marble, bronze, and silver. Unlike earlier Roman busts, harsh, weathered, political, Antinous appeared soft, tragic, divine. He was the new Apollo, the new Ganymede, the eternal boy who died for love. But Antinous was also a political weapon. Hadrian's reign was controversial. His withdrawal from distant conquests was seen as weakness. His Greek obsessions, his love of beauty and philosophy, alienated the Roman elite. By deifying Antinous, Hadrian created a unifying image, one that appealed to East and West, to rich and poor. A dead boy became a bridge between empires. Galen, decades later, would reference the perfection of Antinous's body in his medical texts, as if even science had to bow to his legend. Cyrannus of Ephesus, 2. Operated in a world where the idealized male youth was both specimen and object, examined clinically, yet desired socially. Antinous's image outlived them all, but not his voice. He left no letters, no speeches, no trace of his own will. Hadrian gave him a god's name, but only after taking his life, his story, and turning him into marble. Even in death, Antinous remained property. And Rome would worship that property for centuries. The whip cracked, and they laughed. The banquet hall rang with music, moans, and murmurs. A Greek boy was tied to a pillar, perfumed and bare, his back already striped in red. Around him, senators reclined on couches, sipping spiced wine. One hummed a verse by Ovid. Let her cry, it's sweeter that way. In Rome, pleasure wasn't soft. Pain was performance. Whether at the theater, the brothel, or private homes, Roman elites blurred the line between lust and violence. Slaves were beaten, not just to punish, but to arouse. Prostitutes were branded, not just for ownership, but for spectacle. And in poetry, pain became art. Martial, Catullus, and Juvenal wrote verses that eroticized degradation. They spoke of hair pulled, cheeks slapped, lashes counted, all while framing it as foreplay. In their Rome, domination wasn't cruelty. It was culture. One could whip a slave, then praise her trembling. Bind a boy, then worship his tears. Pleasure was proof of power. Pain was proof of surrender. And surrender was beautiful. In the back of a domus, behind velvet drapes, the real theater began. Here, pleasure wasn't mutual. It was orchestrated, and slaves were the actors. A girl, perhaps 13, would be washed, oiled, and rehearsed. Her master might assign her a persona, the Eastern concubine, the nymph, or the savage. She'd be trained in cries, in postures of submission, in how to bleed prettily. When guests arrived, she'd perform, whether on cushions, tables, or floors. And if she hesitated, the lash corrected her. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't shameful. In fact, elite Roman homes proudly displayed erotic frescoes that depicted beatings, group acts, and the subjugation of women. These images weren't condemned. They were admired. Symbols of sophistication and masculinity. Even in state functions, sex and violence mingled. Festivals like Floralia and Saturnalia blurred public-private lines. Prostitutes danced naked in the streets. Sometimes, slaves were forced to copulate in front of cheering crowds. Their pain dismissed as theatrics. It wasn't just about lust. It was about reminding everyone, especially the enslaved, who owned their bodies. Pain was their silence. In this world of staged moans and sanctioned beatings, even doctors played a role. Galen, Rome's most famous physician, wrote extensively about sexual desire. He cataloged the ways a body reacted to touch, to heat, to pain. He believed that certain women, especially prostitutes, experienced stronger pleasure through punctum dolores, the point of pain. His works were clinical, but the implications were clear. Pain wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Cyrannus of Ephesus, meanwhile, specialized in gynecology. He treated the wounds of pleasure, documenting how force and fear shaped the bodies of enslaved girls. He prescribed treatments not for dignity, but for performance, to ensure the woman could continue her role, no matter the trauma. Poets followed suit. Catullus mocked lovers who preferred gentleness. Juvenal raged against softness, praising domination. Even in satire, the line between humor and horror vanished. Pain became identity. To hurt someone wasn't just acceptable. It was Roman. And for the enslaved, the prostituted, the powerless. Pain wasn't a side effect. It was the main event. She lay still, her belly opened under lamplight. Galen peered in. To him, the female body was not a mystery. It was a flaw. A damp, colder, incomplete version of man. In his scrolls, he called her the inverted male, her uterus a penis. Turned inside, Her ovaries failed testicles. This wasn't metaphor. It was Roman medicine. Galen, physician to emperors and darling of the elite, defined the body in terms of hierarchy. Man above woman, heat above cold, strength above softness. Biology wasn't neutral. It was political. He argued that a woman's womb wandered when not satisfied, causing hysteria. That female desire, though real, was dangerous, needing to be controlled or expelled. He believed that women's bodies, lacking masculine perfection, were always defective, and therefore always needing direction. It's no surprise, then, that Roman law and custom mirrored this logic. If the body was flawed, then its submission was natural. If the womb was weak, then the mind must be too. Thus, science became scripture. Anatomy became ideology. And Galen's words would echo for centuries. Not all Roman doctors agreed with Galen, but few defied his foundations. Soranus of Ephesus, another famed physician, wrote his Gynecology as a manual for managing women, not healing them. He outlined how to care for female slaves, how to regulate menstruation to avoid distraction, how to train concubines to remain sexually desirable into old age. Even his advice for childbirth centered on owner needs, not maternal safety. If a girl got pregnant too young, use herbs, insert wool soaked in cedar oil, or apply heat to the belly. If a woman was barren, examine her for defects or discard her. If a midwife was too emotional, replace her with someone obedient. The female body, in Soranus's hands, became a tool. Maintain it, oil it, silence it. Nowhere in his text is there discussion of consent. Nowhere does he mention trauma. The pain of childbirth, the shame of inspections, the degradation of forced fertility, all erased. Like livestock, the woman was functional. And when no longer useful, forgotten. Galen served emperors, including Marcus Aurelius, and shaped court doctrine with his theories. His definitions of strength, virility, and natural dominance bled into law. A man was fit to rule because he embodied the perfect body. Hot, dry, rational. A woman, cold, moist, impulsive, was ruled by nature. Even in sex, medicine drew lines. Male orgasm was necessary. Female orgasm, optional. Pleasurable perhaps, but never central. Some doctors even warned that too much pleasure could make a woman uncontrollable. Her uterus might wander. Her mind might rebel. So treatments were devised. Devices to control bleeding. Herbs to suppress desire. Rituals to restore obedience. This wasn't fringe science. It was state-backed ideology. And it reinforced every other Roman rule. That women must obey. That slaves must submit. That dominance was not just right. It was natural. So when a girl cried out during examination, when a concubine begged for rest, when a wife dared voice her needs, Rome answered with Galen. The science says no. She was 15. Bent over in the dark, knees drawn up, a linen cloth between her legs. The old woman pressed something warm into her hands, soaked wool, herbs, and a warning. Don't tell your husband. Don't tell your mother. In Roman households, what happened to women's bodies was often done in secret. Miscarriages, forced abortions, infertility treatments, all veiled in whispers because to speak of them was to admit failure, impurity, disobedience. And yet, behind closed doors, women endured everything. They drank potions made from myrrh and silphium to end pregnancies. They inserted wool soaked in oil and vinegar to prevent them. They submitted to midwives who answered not to them, but to fathers, masters, husbands. These weren't rare occurrences. They were systemic. The Roman world teemed with female knowledge passed through pain, but always kept hidden, shrouded in shame. Because in Rome, the body wasn't yours, and your voice? Even less so. Soranus of Ephesus one of the most influential physicians of the Roman Empire, didn't ignore abortion. In fact, he wrote detailed instructions. His medical texts outlined two types: the therapeutic abortion to save a woman from danger, the elective abortion when the child was unwanted. In both cases, Cyrannus warned, avoid too much shaking or harsh tools, not out of compassion, but to protect future fertility. He advised midwives to monitor the woman's emotional state, not because she suffered, but because hysteria might affect the outcome. He listed dozens of methods: standing on tiptoe, jumping backwards 7 times, massaging the abdomen, applying pessaries of rue, myrrh, and bitter herbs. And yet, Cyrannus never referred to a woman's right to choose. The fetus mattered more than her fear. The outcome mattered more than her pain. Even in his landmark work, Gynecology, the woman was always passive, something to be treated, adjusted, managed. The decision belonged to her guardian, not to her dot. So while Cyrannus preserved knowledge, he also preserved silence. In Roman art, the ideal woman was serene, fertile, obedient. She was Venus, but also Vesta, seductive, yet untouched. Her body was to be displayed, but never described. Fertile, but never messy. Controlled, but never questioning. So what happened? When things went wrong, when bleeding wouldn't stop, when labor ended in stillbirth, when a girl miscarried after rape. Nothing. There were no temples for reproductive grief, no legal protections for emotional trauma. Even poetry, with all its lust and excess, stayed quiet on the subject of female loss. Why? Because to admit that a woman suffered, that her body betrayed her, or worse, that someone else had, was to expose the cracks in Roman masculinity. In Roman order. So the stories stayed buried. Between kitchen walls, behind curtained birthing chairs, inside scrolls no man would read aloud in the Forum. Even female slaves who birthed child after child were not praised. Their pain was expected, their silence mandatory, and when they spoke, they were punished, disbelieved, or simply ignored. Because in Rome, to speak of what you endure was rebellion, and rebellion had no place in a system built on domination of body, of voice, of truth. Asterisk. She adjusts the folds of the tunic, not hers, the girl's, the new one, barely 13. Eyes wide with the same terror she once knew. Smile when he looks at you, she says softly. Not too eager, just enough. The candles flicker, just like they did that first night. The goblets gleam the same blood red. The senator's ringed fingers twitch, impatient. And she, the older one, watches it unfold, not with cruelty, not even numbness, but with precision, because she knows the rules now. She's memorized every one of them. She survived by them, and tonight she teaches them. Once she was the centerpiece, the offering, the one stripped and told to submit. Now she prepares others, not because she enjoys it, but because in Rome you survive not by escaping the game, but by becoming the one who knows how to play it. She remembers fighting once. The shame, the screams, the desperate grasp at a name, a self, a memory of home. But those fragments blurred over the years, replaced by routines, rituals, scripts. Let the oil drip here. Not there. Don't eat too much at the banquet. If he tells you to speak, speak softly. If he doesn't, never speak at all. In another life, she might have been a priestess, or a healer, or a mother. Instead, she becomes something far more Roman, an architect of survival, a priestess of performance, because the empire didn't just conquer land, it conquered the inner voice. It taught girls like her to rehearse their worth in mirrors, in moans, in manners, to become what was desired, even before the man opened his mouth. So now, when the girl shakes in fear, she doesn't say, "You'll be okay." She says, breathe like this, smile like that, stay alive. This is Rome's final rule. You become your own captor, and then you pass it on. Outside, the empire roars. New emperors rise. New palaces are built. Names like Hadrian, Claudius, Augustus, their stories carved in stone. But hers? It will never be written. She has no statues, no scrolls. Only glances exchanged in firelight. Only the echo of her footsteps on marble as she prepares another girl for another night. Is she complicit now? Is she cruel? Or is she simply Rama? Because this is the final transformation. Not into a goddess, not into a wife, not even into a whore, but into a machine, a role, a ghost. She doesn't cry anymore. She doesn't flinch. And when the girl asks, "What if I say no?" she only answers, "Then they will take it anyway." So you smile, you breathe, you survive. And eventually, you forget what it felt like to be anything else. Because in Rome, you don't just endure the ritual, you become it. If this story disturbed you, good. It should, because history isn't just names and dates. It's bodies, it's silence, it's survival. Subscribe for more hidden truths they never taught you in school about the girls erased, the rules enforced, and the empires built on pain. Don't just watch history. Feel it, question it, remember it. Because the past never really went away. It just learned to dress differently.